Welcome to another Fathom interview. I am Omer-Jackaman. Joining me is my fellow Deputy Editor, Calev Ben-Dor, and we're delighted to welcome Dr. Rob Geist Pinfold. Rob is a lecturer in peace and security at Durham University. He's a research fellow at the Peace Research Center in Prague and a senior fellow at the Herzl Center for Israel Studies at Charles University. Rob is also the author of Understanding Territorial Withdrawal, Israeli Occupations and Exits, published this year by Oxford University Press. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. So, Rob, I mean, there would have been plenty of reasons to talk to you with your area of inquiry prior to October 7th, but the relevance of that work has obviously become particularly acute since then. You're an expert on both occupation and withdrawal from occupation, topics which in relation to Gaza have dominated much of the fallout from that dreadful day. Let's start with some sort of fundamentals to ground our audience in what we're talking about. Take us through the process and context of Israel's various withdrawals over the years.
Yeah, well, this is something that's really important to note, right? And it's one of the reasons why I was interested in studying this topic, because I'm British, but I lived in Israel previously for 8 years. And the divergences in sort of perspective and attitude when you talk about territorial withdrawal, really struck me. In Israel, people used to say to me, territorial withdrawal is a bad thing. It harms Israel's national security. We should never do it again. Sort of, part of this rightward shift you saw in Israeli public opinion over the years, particularly after Israel left Gaza in 2005. By contrast, whenever I spoke to people in the UK and said, yeah, I'm doing, a PhD on Israel's territorial withdrawals, occupations and withdrawals, they'd say to me, well, Israel's never withdrawn from territory, so you've not got anything to study. And of course, anyone who's immersed themselves in Israel will know that that's not true, right? Israel, yes, it has occupied more territory than most contemporary powers, particularly given it only existed since 1948. It's occupied, particularly in the Six-Day War. We had the whole Sinai Peninsula occupied, the Golan Heights occupied, the West Bank, of course, and the Gaza Strip. So that was from Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. In the 1980s, Israel then occupied Lebanon. In 1982, it invaded Lebanon, and then eventually it sort of retrenched its occupation apart from a sliver of territory on its border within southern Lebanon, or bordering northern Israel, the so-called security zone. And that occupation lasted until the year 2000, when Israel eventually withdrew there. On the Sinai Peninsula front, Israel withdrew from the Sinai Peninsula in 1982 as part of a peace deal with Egypt, the so-called Land for Peace agreement that basically facilitated Israel leaving the Sinai in exchange for a concession from its rival, a peace treaty. That was kind of, I guess, the ideal, if in Israeli terms, particularly if you're a dovish Israeli, the ideal type of withdrawal, what Israel would want in exchange for territory. In Lebanon, that wasn't the case. Israel left southern Lebanon in May 2000 in what is often called a unilateral withdrawal. Israel also left the Gaza Strip in late 2005, and that's also termed a unilateral withdrawal. So those are two withdrawals where Israel supposedly left territory without actually getting any corresponding political concessions from a rival. So you have very, very different types of withdrawal. You also have very, very different types of occupation. You have some occupations where Israel brought in settlers, some occupations where Israel relied on local proxies for support, such as in southern Lebanon. And of course, most critically, you have some occupations that have not ended in exit, most obvious being the West Bank. Israel's withdrawn from some, but not all of the West Bank, and the Golan Heights, which Israel's not only not withdrawn from, but also annexed. So in speaking in a kind of international relations methodological perspective, in this one case study, i.e. Israel, its conflict with its Arab neighbors, there's so many divergences on in terms of types of occupation and indeed types of withdrawal, which is why I wanted to look into it in greater detail.
Rob, I guess really the focus of our conversation and the current situation related to Gaza. How do you understand Israel's withdrawal in 2005 as it relates to facilitates, precipitates, whatever the current situation? How do you in the history, how do you see Israel's withdrawal playing a role in what we're seeing now?
To cut a long story short, Israel's withdrawal from Gaza in 2005 has been co-opted by the Israeli right to create a very powerful and very salient narrative that is actually very rarely challenged within contemporary Israel. And that has resurfaced predictably after the tragic events of October the 7th. This perception primarily that we left Gaza, we got rockets, we tried to give it up to the Palestinians. They should have created a Singapore of the Middle East. That was the idea. We didn't ask for concessions in return. We gave up territory unilaterally. And what did we get? We got Hamas coming to power and we got rockets. And that obviously led to the attacks of October the 7th. Now, in my book, I challenged that narrative from start to finish. First of all, Israel didn't leave Gaza in 2005. Israel had already left around 81% of the Gaza Strip in the early 90s. Israel in 2005 only left around the 19% of the Gaza Strip that is still controlled, primarily isolated settlements and military bases, which were frankly a logistical nightmare for the IDF to defend, which as a result, before the October 7 attacks, there was a clear decline in casualties Israel faced as a result of Gaza-based attacks from the withdrawal up to the present day. That's something Israelis often forget. They think that basically we left Gaza, we got rockets, we got casualties. Second, on the rockets, there were rockets being fired from within the Gaza Strip before Israel left the territory. There were rockets fired from the Gaza Strip after Israel left the territory. It's not a linear causal path as many Israelis think. There were many years after Israel left Gaza where the rockets fired in that year was less than the years prior when Israel was still within the Gaza Strip. And indeed, the fact that those rockets were being fired when Israel was within the territory really undermined the occupation, because the whole idea of keeping those soldiers and settlers in the Strip was that they would basically be, a human and indeed a territorial buffer against hostile Palestinian groups. They would absorb the attacks. But the fact that they were regularly being attacked by Palestinians within the Gaza Strip and those rockets were firing over their heads into the Gaza Strip really undermined this long-term Israeli preference for what many people call strategic depth. There's attachment to territory, taking territory outside of Israel in order to kind of push the conflict back. And that's where it all comes around today, because you're seeing a resuscitation of this doctrine of strategic depth, something that Israel has largely abandoned, to be honest, apart from in the West Bank and to a lesser extent in the Golan Heights. You're seeing people, for example, Eli Cohen, Israel's foreign minister, saying that Gaza's borders will have to change, the territory will shrink. Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, has called for a buffer zone, and Netanyahu has called for Israel to indefinitely control Gaza's security, whatever that nebulous term may mean. It seems like Israel is shifting back towards strategic depth. But first of all, the Gaza occupation shows why that is flawed, because Israel's casualties were higher when it was there. It was getting more international condemnation, and indeed those rockets were still being fired. But it also, you also have to look at this narrative that Israel wanted to create a Singapore of the Middle East in Gaza. If you look at the comments by individuals involved in the disengagement plan, people at the heart of the plan, these are not conspiracy theories. It's not things that I found looking through archives late at night. These are public statements. People like Dov Weisglass, Ariel Sharon's chief of staff, arguing the whole point of the disengagement is to freeze the current situation as much as possible. In short, Israel gave up territory it didn't really value, that 19% of the Gaza Strip, in order to lead to a decrease in international and indeed enemy pressure from the Palestinians to try and keep the status quo frozen for as long as possible. That's what Israel got as a result of its withdrawal from Gaza. The disengagement was effectively too effective, not ineffective, in that it meant that Israel was able to park conveniently, in the words of Dov Weisglass, in an interim political situation that would prevent the formation of a Palestinian state. And that leads us back to the events of October the 7th, where Hamas basically broke this status quo. They broke the ceasefire with Israel, and as a result, the deck is still being very much reshuffled in terms of what a post-war order might look like, and indeed whether Israel will occupy the Gaza Strip and how long it will stay for, and indeed when and how it should leave.
So, Rob, if I could, firstly, I thought that was fascinating. I just want to push back on two things for now, maybe more later. I mean, you are right. You know, and I would, for those who are particularly interested, I'd recommend our listeners Google the kind of there. I think there's a series of, or at least one or two interviews that Weissglass gives with Haaretz. He uses there's maybe there's a chemical term that ends with "ide."
Formaldehyde. He claimed
go.
that the engagement
Yes.
was formaldehyde. When I asked him about this, he said to me that he made a mistake because he's not a chemist and that he meant to say, I believe it was liquid nitrogen, because liquid nitrogen freezes things in place, whereas formaldehyde is used to preserve dead tissue. And he said, oh, yeah, that was a mistake. I didn't mean that, and it was taken out of context. But I don't buy that, to be honest with you, Calev.
No, what I was going to say is that I know that, it was meant to freeze things. And Weissglass also talks about, when the Palestinians become Finns, as in when they become like Finland. But of course, the context of that is the double whammy of the failure of final status negotiations with the Palestinians in 2000, the impression, which I'd say most Israelis share, of Palestinians not being a partner, and the breakout of the Intifada, both of which completely destroy the left. As in, and the impression that long-term occupation of Gaza, where there's 8,000 Jews and 1.58 million Palestinians, can't continue. So where I would push back is, you're right that it was an interim freezing of the thing, but it comes in the context of two things. Occupation long-term of Gaza is untenable, and the Palestinians aren't a partner. So that's kind of one pushback. The one smaller pushback I'd make, I'm not convinced the right co-opted the argument that we left and we got rockets. Just think, and I don't think you're wrong in your explanation, but most non-academic Israelis will join the dots. And yeah, there were rockets before, but they were at best or reaching Ashkelon. And most Israelis don't need to be co-opted by the right wing to make the equation of, when we were there weren't rockets on Tel Aviv, and when we left, there were. So it's really more about the wording, but I think that's just and listen, you were also here, so you've probably got a lot of Israeli friends. I think that's just the natural conclusion that Israelis come to. And actually, what I'd love to ask you about is how you think you said October the 7th shifts the cards, which it does. How do you think October the 7th links to the conception of withdrawal going forwards?
Can I add an element to come back in on as well, which is the same rationale, the same we left and we got rockets rationale, but in southern Lebanon too, with the rise of Hezbollah. So if you could,
we got rockets and a fundamentalist, maximalist entity on our borders.
Yes.
So I'm sure you've also heard many times from Israelis.
Yes, I did many times, and those are some very good and very comprehensive and numerous questions. So what I'm going to do is try and answer them, but if I neglect to answer part of it, then please go full Jeremy Paxman and push me on this, because I'm not trying to avoid the question. I'm just trying to not talk for too long.
Jack will Paxman it.
Indeed, exactly. So on the last point you raised, and I think this is a really important point, the whole, we left, we got rockets. You always used to see, whilst Israel was in southern Lebanon, as Jack gives the example, you always used to see these maps basically saying, here's Hezbollah's rocket range whilst Israel is in the security zone. If Israel were to leave the security zone, those rockets would be on Israel's border, so the range would get longer. And that's, I guess, the argument the Israeli right made at the time, and that's what they argue in retrospect they were justified in believing. But I think it's critical to note that as the Israeli right often do underline, Hamas and Hezbollah are very, very closely linked to Iran. They're part of this axis of resistance. Where do most of these rockets come from? They are not, until very recently, made locally within the territories. They are imported. This is why you're seeing, countless Israeli airstrikes in Syria against attempted weapons transfers to Hezbollah. This idea that, the territory was keeping the rockets away, it frankly, to me, doesn't stand the test of time, because they were getting rockets from elsewhere. If someone else wanted them to have rockets with a longer range, they could get them and they would be provided with those rockets. So this idea that territory was keeping us safe, I just don't think it stands up the test of time. Yes, you're right about having those fundamentalist actors, rejectionist actors on Israel's border, but it's also important to remember how those fundamentalists, what led to the creation or the empowerment of those fundamentalist actors. For Hezbollah, certainly, it was Israel's presence in the security zone. The security zone created Hezbollah. It would not exist without the security zone. When Israeli forces initially went into southern Lebanon, they were welcomed by the local Lebanese Shia because Israel's threat there was not Hezbollah at the time. It was Palestinian groups who were using the territory and the power vacuum within the territory to launch rocket attacks and infiltrations into Israel. Israel unfortunately fell into the standard trap that occupiers fall into of going in and thinking that they're going to be welcomed and this welcome will be indefinite. But friction between occupier and occupied, which is frankly often inevitable, led to a radicalization of the Lebanese Shia population with, by the way, Iranian logistical, financial and military support to radicalize that population that then created Hezbollah. Similar story with Hamas. Okay, Israelis think that Hamas took power in 2007. Yes, Hamas did launch a violent coup against the Palestinian Authority in the Gaza Strip. Nevertheless, Hamas was already operating and kind of already established a state within parts of the Gaza Strip before Israel's withdrawal. As I mentioned previously, Israel had long abandoned 81% of the Gaza Strip. So basically, Hamas used that power vacuum and had established themselves there, and then indeed used the fact that Israel continues to occupy the territory, that daily friction, as a way to justify their attacks and to increase their base and their power. Similarly, in Lebanon, you hear people argue there were only 3 infiltrations during the time of the security zone, therefore it worked. Palestinians previously were infiltrating Israel much more regularly. We're talking southern Lebanon here. But the reason that Hezbollah didn't infiltrate northern Israel very much during the time of the security zone is less to do with Israel's tactical successes and more to do with the fact that there were soldiers for them to kill within the security zone. They didn't have to cross into Israel to attack Israelis. There were much more convenient Israeli targets in their midst when they could hide and shelter in Shia villages, for example. So yet again, it's this argument that keeping the territory stopped X from happening. And I think that's an extremely simplistic argument that doesn't stand up to the test of time. Please remind me of your other questions so I don't dodge them.
Yeah, I mean, so post October the 7th, where do you see the whole discussion about withdrawal going? Because what I'm hearing and what I'm interpreting is let's leave rockets aside, because if you've got a range of 50, 100, 200 kilometers, and there's no security zone that's going to work. But what I'm hearing from you is when Israeli soldiers were there, then it was the Israeli soldiers who were being targets. But then if we expand out to October the 7th, when the Israeli soldiers aren't there, it's the civilians who are the targets. So where do you see this whole discussion over withdrawal going in a post? We're still in it, but in a post-October the 7th world, how do you see these discussions about withdrawal playing out?
Well, I think within Israel, as I mentioned, you can see that re-emphasis on strategic depth coming from Israel's leadership. You're also seeing pressure against this right-wing government's policies from their own base. You know, there's an event being held in Tel Aviv today, and I believe the title is Expel, Occupy, Settle, which is probably not the best PR exercise because it's pretty easily translated into English and it doesn't sound very good. You saw that Ministry of Intelligence document basically calling for the mass transfer of Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip and into the Sinai. Now, I'm hesitant to sort of make a big deal out of this because, I mean, anyone who knows Israeli politics will know that the Ministry of Intelligence is a complete nonsense made-up ministry that doesn't actually have any tangible power. So it's not the smoking gun that critics like to argue that it is. But I think one thing is worth mentioning in that report, that it basically says that doing this, basically ethnically cleansing the Gaza Strip and transferring its population, is politically preferable to the establishment of a Palestinian state, which is an existential threat for Israel. And I would argue that actually going down that very dangerous route of ethnic cleansing is a far more existential threat. You risk basically, you're putting yourself in head-on collision with the Biden administration, for example. You're going to create a massive domestic dissensus within Israel. This is exactly the sort of thing that causes a crisis. So you're seeing that shift back towards strategic depth. I don't think it'll work, by the way, because, again, if Israel does have a buffer zone, what's to stop, as you mentioned, Palestinians firing rockets from within Gaza City, the parts that Israel doesn't control, into Israel itself? What Israel needs to do, and what worries me the most, is its lack of a plan for the day after Hamas. You know, maybe Israel will manage... people say to me, you can't get rid of Hamas from the Gaza Strip. You can't remove them from power. I challenge that assumption, because actually Hamas is, it's far beyond a terrorist organization. It's basically a state. Okay, Hamas rules over the day-to-day bureaucratic banalities of life. For example, policing, schools, healthcare, all those kind of things, utilities. So you can remove Hamas from power in that sense. You might not be able to eliminate Hamas's ideology, for example, or its followers, but you can remove Hamas from power. The question is what comes next? What's the day after here? And this is one of the key reasons the ground invasion was delayed, by the way, because the Biden administration were trying to get answers from the Israelis on this topic. What actually is your plan to transform any military victories into long-term political successes? They didn't like the answers they were getting from the Israelis, not because the answers were extreme, like that Ministry of Intelligence document, but because the Israelis didn't seem to know themselves. So one of the things that Benny Gantz, when he entered the coalition, demanded was the setting up of a committee to consider the day after Gaza, what happens there. The US is kind of trying to steer Israel in this direction, saying, we're against an indefinite occupation, we're against the blockade, for example. So Israel is kind of putting itself on a collision course with the US in returning to strategic depth. And as I argue in my book, historically, strategic depth has not been very effective. Yes, had Israel remained in Gaza from 2005, you might have seen very different looking faces of Israeli casualties on October the 7th. But you probably still would have seen a lot of Israeli casualties. There might have been soldiers, they might have been settlers, but settlers are still civilians. These are still women and children and families and old people. So whether it's inside or outside of Israel, you would have seen a significant number of civilian casualties. So I don't think, I think it's fair to say resettlement is not the way to go. I think that will put Israel on a collision course with the Biden administration, but so will strategic depth. And as my book shows, it just historically has not worked very well in Israel's favor in terms of enhancing its national security.
Thanks,
I apologize, that was a long-winded answer. I hope
no, not at all.
that
Not
made
at all.
sense.
I mean, let's stay with a little bit of kind of prognostication about the day after. As you say, the Biden administration has made publicly clear in the last few days that reoccupation is not a desirable outcome. By the same token, the idea of a Gaza Strip whose security is independent feels rather far off. I mean, let's in a sense look at this through a sort of West Bank lens, maybe. I mean, explain for viewers what the different areas of the West Bank or the arrangements for the different areas of the West Bank are, and what you think, what kind of analogous arrangement you think might be most relevant in Gaza post Hamas.
I don't think the West Bank is particularly relevant because obviously, we have that kind of situation where Israel controls most of the territory, but the Palestinian Authority runs those day-to-day mundane aspects of life in the areas with most Palestinians. I just don't think that the international community, and particularly the US, will allow that to continue indefinitely within the Gaza Strip. What we'd be talking about was kind of a long-term vision of Bennett's plan, and indeed kind of what the IDF are doing at the moment, rather than entering the urban areas, kind of positioning themselves, encircling those urban areas in a contemporary form of siege warfare, basically waiting Hamas out on this. And that could well work And indeed, so far, Israel's been doing relatively well in terms of its campaign, but I don't think that's a long-term viable political strategy, simply given those red lines that the Biden administration has delineated. And let's remember that the Biden administration are probably the most supportive of Israel's position of any actor in the international community. So Israel has to remember that even though it likes to think that it's completely independent, it is still reliant on external support and indeed has often in the past folded in the face of external pressure. My ideal scenario, and this is there's a lot of ifs and a lot of buts here, would be handing the territory over to the Palestinian Authority, as the Biden administration has been advocating for. But you have to accept that, as you mentioned, Jack, the Palestinian Authority is very weak in the West Bank. Okay, it can barely control territory in the West Bank, so it's just a pipe dream to think you can just put it in Gaza tomorrow and everything will be fine. What you probably have to have is the simultaneous rehabilitation of Gaza and the demilitarization of Gaza. Now, a lot of the demilitarization will probably take place whilst Israel's occupying the territory. Rehabilitation will have to take place immediately afterwards. And I suspect the most viable candidate is a multinational Arab-led coalition that would have to include at least the support of the Egyptians, the Qataris, the Jordanians, and the Saudis. The issue here that the Biden administration is facing is convincing any of these actors to have a tangible on-the-ground role in Gaza, because they don't want to be seen as legitimizing Israel, and also Gaza is frankly a logistical and strategic nightmare. Israel has never really had a concrete, comprehensive plan for what to do with the territory, which is why it's kind of occupied left over all these years. So it really is kind of a poisoned political chalice to pass on. Having said that, I think there are ways to do it. We were talking about normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia before October the 7th. And what Saudi Arabia was going to get was not primarily concessions or anything particularly substantive from the Israelis. It will be getting things from the US in terms of political, military, financial support. What the Biden administration could do is offer the Saudis and other Arab states a kind of package like that, if they were to oversee at least policing and security in the Gaza Strip, whilst the Palestinian Authority deals with the bureaucratic everyday lives of Gazans, with the view that eventually there would be an Arab or a multinational force withdrawing from that territory and ceding power to the Palestinian Authority. That relies on a lot of ifs and a lot of buts. Granted, but Mohammed bin Salman, is very much a known risk taker. So if anyone was going to go for this, it may well be the Saudis. There is going to be a lot of convincing to do. It's going to have to come from the Biden administration rather than Israel. But at the end of the day, I think that is a much more sustainable scenario than an indefinite Israeli occupation of the territory. It's just kind of a quote here. When Israel formed the security zone in 1985 in southern Lebanon, Shimon Peres said, "This will be the IDF's last winter in Lebanon." It's kind of like the Israeli version of "the war will be over by Christmas." Israel only left 15 years later, and it didn't manage to basically achieve its goals. As I say, it got rid of the Palestinians who were threatening Israel, but it created a much more significant strategic threat, that is Hezbollah. We don't want to see the same thing happening in the Gaza Strip, where Israel withdraws and either you get a return to the status quo ante, where Hamas takes power again, or someone even more intransigent comes along to replace them. And this is not something that just Israeli policymakers have struggled with, right? Look at the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. What happened? As soon as the US left, the Taliban came back. And I think that's the main motivating factor for the US putting all of this pressure on Israel to consider a day after Hamas scenario, because the US has learned the lessons from its forever wars. Israel has not, despite the fact it has conducted more than enough of these so-called forever occupations themselves.
Thanks. I mean, just to push back ever so slightly on some of, or to probe some of that ever so slightly, because I think I would agree with you on the sustainability and in many senses the desirability of that model versus any reoccupation, certainly. But given the level of unpopularity of the Palestinian Authority in Gaza, its wide perception of it as corrupt, sclerotic, nepotistic, call it, whatever, we can think of as many words as we like. You're talking
Yeah,
about
none of them good.
none of them nice words, right?
Yeah.
You're talking about an internal policing that is not a short-term thing. In other words, maintaining the interim control of the Palestinian Authority, that interim could be until they're able to establish it on their own, could take quite some time. And I don't personally sense Saudi, Egyptian, Arab coalition willingness for that kind of boots on the ground mechanism. So I'm just interested as to where if you have any optimism for that willingness might come from.
I kind of touched on it before, Jack. I believe the US will have to offer the Saudis significant political and financial concessions. There will have to be a kind of, we often hear after every kind of confrontation, a new Marshall Plan for Gaza that then never materializes. That will actually have to materialize this time. And you're right, this is a very, very difficult scenario to envision. And if by some chance it were to transpire, that's not the end of it. It'd still have to actually work. Okay, this force would have to actually manage to train and equip and support the Palestinian Authority so they would be stable enough to take over governance and policing once this force leaves. And indeed, Israel would have to get enough guarantees that it could leave the territory and hand it over to this force in the first place, right? So we're talking a lot of hypotheticals here. But I think one of the key things to consider here is that in my book, I show that occupation, particularly indefinite occupation, is not particularly effective. Okay, in fact, it's extremely ineffective. It's been tried and tested time and time and time all over again. But for a plethora of reasons, mainly because you go into a territory to try and neutralize a security threat, but by virtue of you being in that territory, you create new security threats and legitimize those security threats against you. So any sort of prolonged occupation by Israel, I think, has less of a chance at succeeding. And I think this is why there was a key disagreement, by the way, between the IDF and the political echelon in Israel before the ground invasion. A lot of figures in the IDF were kind of favoring a shock and awe offensive, right? Going straight into those urban centers, kind of causing as much damage to Hamas's infrastructure as possible, and then eventually leaving. What Israel did in the West Bank which kind of helped quell the Intifada, Operation Defensive Shield, when it reoccupied a lot of territory it had left to the Palestinian Authority. So the army were kind of hoping for a repeat of that, based on the perception that they probably can't get rid of Hamas. We can do them significant damage, and then we can leave. And Israel's government, and indeed the Biden administration, thought that this policy wasn't going to get you anywhere. I agree, but at the same time, I don't think prolonged occupation is a more viable, sustainable alternative that will bring Israel any degree of security, or at least any more security than the other potential options.
Rob, I just want to clarify, are you suggesting that a normalization agreement where the Saudis give recognition to Israel and in return they get to control Gaza is not an attractive option for them?
Well, that's exactly right. But what I'm suggesting is that the Israelis park their dreams of normalization. Okay, they basically that was what Israel wanted from the Saudis, right? What the Saudis wanted in exchange for that normalization was a massive package of political, financial, military support from the US. Israel will just have to park this dream of normalizing relations with the Saudis for the time being, and maybe the Biden administration can take that package and entice the Saudis to lead a multinational Arab force in the Gaza Strip. Look, it's in their interest to contain and roll back Hamas. We know that there's been this decades-long proxy conflict in the Middle East between the so-called axis of resistance and more status quo powers. The axis of resistance being Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and the status quo powers being the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and to a lesser extent, Jordan and Egypt. So it's in their interest to contain or even roll back Iranian influence and power, particularly amongst the Palestinians. So that could be the political reason for the Saudis to get involved. And then obviously there's that support you get from a superpower. This has worked before in the past, by the way, against Israel. One of the reasons Israel gave up the entire Sinai Peninsula is because it got so much in military, political aid and financial support from the United States. Basically, the US changed Israel's decision-making calculus. They said, look, the Israelis are not going to give up the Sinai because they think this territory is so valuable for them. But what if we basically give them a de facto alliance and $3 billion a year in aid from the US, which is where that comes from, by the way, that's often forgotten. What if we give them this de facto alliance and unlimited financial support in exchange for them leaving the Sinai? And that's what worked. That's what got Israel out of the Sinai. So if anything's going to get the Saudis in Gaza, it's something along those lines.
Rob, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I think one to which we will have to return as developments continue. Rob Geist Pinfold, thank you very much indeed.